Let's discuss this development. Global Affairs Analyst Sam Phatey joins us from Washington, D.C. Good to have you join us.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about the significance of what's going on now in Ukraine. About 4 regions. There is Kherson and Zaporizhia in one part of Ukraine, and then Luhansk and Donetsk in the eastern part of Ukraine. And when we look at the expanse of land that is to be taken by Russia, if this annexation pulls through, it's about 15% of Russia. And some have said that's about the size of Hungary alone. I just want you to speak to the significance of this.
Well, I think Russia had a very deep plan of order, especially to have it annexed. They sponsored a rebellion in the region for a very long time. And so this is just a matter of consolidating and trying to legitimize the annexation of Donetsk. Of course, the annexation itself, having it done through referendum, does not quite make it legitimate. And in all of the 4 regions that they are having referendums in, these referendums have been conducted at the time of war. And it feels like the people are getting cursed into taking part in a referendum. So you cannot say it is free, fair, and you cannot argue anywhere that it is done through the consent of the people. So we have seen it happen in Crimea, and because they feel like there have been no consequences after the referendum in Crimea, that the same thing is going to happen in this eastern part of Ukraine. Now, obviously, this one thing that this tells us moving forward is that this war is going to be prolonged, and there's going to be tension between Russia and Ukraine. It can even after a century, Ukrainians will fight to get these lands back. So this conflict is going to be one of history that would be ongoing for a very long time.
And you've started touching on my next question, which is the fact that some residents believe that this referendum, and if they vote yes, is a way to end the war and de-escalate the fighting there. But the indications that this could actually escalate the war, and that's because Russia would then now claim that any attack on those territories is an attack on its territory. So speak to this.
It will, in fact, it's not just an escalation, it is going to redirect the war, which is just having a referendum in one area does not mean that Ukrainian troops are not going to attack that land. They are going to attack it, and they are going to try to reclaim those lands. I mean, there have been a lot of cities that Russia, for example, have already they have occupied in Ukraine since the war started, but they have been pushed back from those towns and from those cities. And then when that happened, what the Kremlin did in Moscow was to focus on the eastern region. And obviously, the agenda for that is to annex it. But whether they claim that is part of Russia, it simply means if they claim legally that is part of Russia after a referendum, that means Ukrainian troops have now crossed into Russia and to fight and reclaim those lands back from Russia. Now, the difference is with the international community. Ukraine doesn't have to conduct a referendum to reclaim those lands. And Russia is pretty much having a referendum to legitimize that they can now claim those lands that those people freely and willingly want to join Russia. It is going to redirect the war, and the war would have gone from Russia trying to overthrow the government in Kiev and install their own government that they can control. Once they know that this is not going to be achievable, they try to annex. And so now the war has been redirected from trying to overthrow the Kiev government to try to annex part of Russia. And what Ukraine have to do is to reclaim those lands.
Almost as though Putin is desperate for any kind of military victory he can get from this war. But let me ask you, because we've seen the international condemnation, especially from the UNGA, and many leaders say, look, we're not going to recognize this. But we've seen what happened with Crimea. Whether you recognize it or not, this is really not about legitimacy. You cannot have any sort of international business right now in Crimea without Russia saying this is an interference in my own territory. So how much will international recognition, how much effect will international recognition and legitimacy have in terms of how Russia is able to hold on to these territories?
The interesting thing about international law is that it is very hard to implement locally if the political will is not there. And anybody who has the military power is the person that has control of that area. As long as human history is concerned, territories and boundaries, borders have always been created through conquest. That's pretty much the Russian strategy. Yes, we might be in the 21st century, but it is no different from how new territories and new boundaries and new borders were created. And that's pretty much it is medieval, but it is a medieval tactic and a medieval strategy of conquest that has been used in the 21st century by the Kremlin. We have to admit it. So, which means that if anybody wants to do anything in these regions, you have to fight back to claim those regions back. Now, the international community can condemn all we want. They can condemn and say this is unacceptable, we do not recognize it, but that is how it stands because they have the military gain, the military power there. So unless the military power is taken away from them, then the fact is the status quo is going to remain as far as Russia is concerned. Now, why is the international community not getting themselves involved? Because you have NATO, and of course, Ukraine is not a NATO ally. It's an ally, but it's not a NATO member country. But why are other countries that are allies with Ukraine not militarily stepping in directly? It's simple. They want to avoid a world war, and they want to avoid any use of nuclear and chemical weapons in this country, despite the fact that evidence has shown that there have been war crimes committed in Ukraine with the unveiling of mass graves in the country. So again, military power means they have authority there. That military power has to be eliminated in order for Russia to be pushed back.
And let me quickly ask you, just to turn our attention to Russia itself, where we understand that people are now fleeing the country as because of the remobilization of reservists, 300,000 of them that Putin has called for. And we understand that people are fleeing to countries like Georgia, Finland, and Serbia. Do you think that that is an indication that in Russia, this is mostly seen as Putin's war and not Russia's war?
It is an unpopular war. I mean, a lot of the soldiers went thinking that when they get to Ukraine, they would be welcomed and cheered, but instead it was ordinary citizens of Ukraine who were armed and who were pushing them back, who were fighting them. So they actually they were actually demoralized, and that affected the Russian military's push. So the reality is, Putin is trying to win militarily by any at all cost, and this is a war that he has lost in terms of public opinion already. And militarily, he must admit that he has suffered a very demoralizing defeat in the hands of ordinary Ukrainian citizens. So at this point in time, yes, they have the military might because they have the weapons and the manpower for a huge country like Russia with its military capacity, still trying to push and couldn't even take over the Ukrainian capital, which they thought they could have done in a few weeks, shows that the Ukrainians are resisting against it. And the Russians know this, despite the media blackout in Russia about the war, and they don't want to participate in this war. They don't want to have any part of it. And this is why a lot of people are demonstrating now in Moscow, and they are also leaving the country because they don't want to take part in a senseless war anymore. I think Putin has to learn to accept this and probably try to come up with a new strategy. But he thinks that
and
maybe
especially because soldiers are also not returning from the war. There's no Russian soldier who has returned from the war, so people wonder. But I'm afraid I'm being told. Sorry, I'm afraid I'm being told my time is up. Global Affairs Analyst Sam Phatey, thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.